You are listening to Heavily Accented Philosophy of Law, a podcast powered by the HAPL Project.
Not doing the introductory part because
we just jump into the frame immediately.
A couple of days ago, we welcomed Marco Segatti in Belgrade, who is here with us today.
Mm-hmm.
And
Thank you.
we are going to talk a bit about most probably habits, but also
Anything that comes to mind.
yeah, but also anything that comes to mind. And given that Julieta already has some experience with recording of podcasts, I'm handing the mic to her.
Well, thank you very much, Marco, for being here, for being in Belgrade. I think that we can just start by asking you to vote in this poll that we don't have yet, but it is starting now, about the name of this podcast. We have two possibilities. One is incomplete theorized disagreements, and the other one is heavily accent philosophy of law.
Yes. I don't know. They both sound very good names, actually. Can you have a subtitle? Like, choose one? No, that's not a voting option. But incompletely theorized disagreements, I like them a lot, actually. Yeah. So I would vote for that.
Yeah, it's a good name. It's still my favorite. Jules is going, I think, for the heavily accented philosophy of law for kind of obvious reasons. I mean, we had Gerald Postema at one point, so he didn't have any accents.
Heavy accent, yeah, exactly.
We'll see. So we're counting in a vote. Marco Segatti gives his vote to the incompletely theorized disagreements. Mm-hmm. Now it even started flowing because it's kind of complicated to pronounce. Incompletely theorized disagreements, but also heavily accented.
But we can pronounce it with a heavy accent, like incomplete theorized disagreements.
But do you say heavy accent in English?
Or heavily accented.
Yeah?
Heavy accent?
Is that a thick accent?
I have...
Because thickly accented disagreements or philosophy, it's even, I don't know, yeah.
That
it wasn't in the option, I shouldn't add to...
You did good, because if we made a mistake in actually formulating the title, then this title has the upper hand. Because we're kind of just sure that this works in English, and we're not sure that heavily accented...
I think that I have heard, like, this person has a heavy accent. Also, I heard this person has a thick accent. I don't know. I really don't know. We will have to ask ChatGPT.
But making a mistake would be also a plus. You know, like...
okay.
I mean, you understand what it means, right? But if it's not really the way that an English speaker would say it, then it's even better than that. You know, because it kind of realizes the concept. I mean, someone with a heavy accent or a thick accent obviously wouldn't know how to say it.
Absolutely. This was a good idea, inviting people to vote for this and commenting the possible names. So after 10 episodes of the podcast, we'll settle on one title eventually.
Or you have other 10 names probably added to everybody.
But we'll see.
Okay, so now we have one vote to these incomplete theorized disagreements, and then all the ideas that follow. For example, the subtitle, and then the thickly accented philosophy of law, which I really like. So, but let's now move to you, Marco.
Okay.
So maybe you can tell us a little about you in the sense of, for example, what has been your academic career? What did you do before coming in this moment to Belgrade?
All right. So, well, I was born and raised in Pavia a few years ago. And I studied there my first degree in law. And it was the time when there was this big reform of Italian higher education. So we have 2 degrees now in law. Like the 3 years and 2 years. Now it changed again. So anyways, so I've done my first stuff in Pavia. And then I did my PhD always in law, in civil procedure, actually, at the University of Bologna. But I was moving back and forth from Pavia to Bologna because meanwhile I was working as a lawyer in Milan. I was, well, not as a trainee in law. And then while still doing my PhD in Bologna, I did 1 year at Harvard, where I did the LLM, which was financed by the Bank of Italy. So, yeah, so I had a full free ride to Harvard Law School. And then after that, I wasn't really satisfied with what I did in my PhD, or at least not completely. So I wanted a more, partly because I wasn't really involved in Bologna very much. So I wanted, a more, I found out later, actually, the kind of experience I wanted, which I didn't really get in Chicago, where I took my second PhD. Kind of confusing myself. But anyways, so one thing, and after Chicago, during Chicago, I went for the first time, and then I stayed there on and off for basically 10 years at the University of Girona, at the private law department, I think, but it's the philosophy of law group at the University of Girona. Jordi Ferrer, Diego Papayanis, Carmen Vázquez, and now Diego Dei Vecchi also, and all the PhD students. And I think this is very similar to the experience in Genoa, which I'm now starting. I have a group, and from what I see also here, which is quite rare, right? So I have a group of people who don't necessarily work together in the sense of writing papers together. When that happens, wonderful. But, in legal theory and philosophy, perhaps this is still a little bit more, relatively less frequent than in other disciplines like economics or theology, or even more the hard sciences, so-called. But anyway, so the idea of having a large group of people who sometimes eat together, they all work in the same place, they go to the office, and they meet for coffee, they constantly talk about the work, but not only the work. I think this is really a different experience than the one that I was exposed to both in Pavia and in Bologna while doing my PhD, and I think it really makes a difference. I mean, a substantial difference in terms of both work productivity and new ideas that you have, and criticism on the ideas that you already have, but also in terms of enjoying the work more. Like when, I don't want to sound too cynical, but what we do as philosophers of law. So I'm a little bit of a procedural law guy, but more and more a philosophy of law guy and political philosophy. And especially, that's true also, I guess, in procedural law, but a little bit less true. But certainly it's true in the philosophy of law. I mean, what we do has virtually no impact whatsoever on anything, right? Yes. We all know that. No, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate the claim. I think there is an important role for philosophers. I mean, I guess sometimes it's over-exaggerated, I guess. I don't like the philosopher, political leader kind of idea, right? I think it's a different job. But anyway, so what we do is, well, we give classes, and that's a big part, of course. We teach students. But what we do all day is think about our own research. And eventually the output is a paper. And if you're lucky enough, 100 people will read it. I mean, if you're extremely lucky. You shouldn't so much lucky that you shouldn't even expect that. I mean, if a couple of people read it, it's already a huge success. Then you should aim for a little bit more than 2 citations. But I mean, not all citations are previously read, right? So that's also understood. So, and the paper has an argument, perhaps an argument you've worked on for a very long time, and you really put effort in it. But then you don't really know whether you're right or wrong because there isn't a universally accepted standard for telling whether you're right or wrong. And certainly you don't have it, right? That's the point, partly. And so it's very easy to, start having doubts that what you do actually make any sense at all. Unless, and this was the point, you meet other people who are passionate about the argument and, they give you argument against basically virtually everything you say, right? So, and they do it passionately with sometimes anger, hopefully managing the anger, and sometimes, fighting somewhat. I mean, hopefully no violence. I mean, I've never experienced any violence in academia, so I'm not saying that. But, it gives you a sense that what you're doing, I mean, it's not going to save the world. I mean, nobody does that, perhaps. I don't know, but, at least it matters, right? So it's really, having this group dynamic of people talking about their stuff and fighting over it, it's something that I really, literally first experienced in Girona. Mm-hmm. And I see that it has, I mean, I'm sure Jordi took inspiration also from the dynamics in Genoa, which I guess they're going to be a little bit different, but it's the same intuition, and it's the same intuition that I see here with this office space, that it's really an apartment, and, you can drink coffee, you can have a nice conversation, and all the while keep working, of course. That's what we're supposed to do, what we're paid for. But, I think it's the best antidepressant that you can get, honestly.
Yeah, I'm usually, you started so many interesting topics that I've been thinking about, and I think we also had conversations about this, maybe even recorded in the first episode of the podcast. So we can kind of maybe split it into some issues that we can discuss before we even start discussing the matter that we wanted to discuss today, and it's fascinating to me. So now, it would seem obvious, and I think we share this intuition all, that the impact of our researches or research in philosophy of law can and often is quite low from a perspective of like societal changes. Nobody produces sweeping societal changes. I mean, if we take...
Not by themselves.
Definitely not. But for example, if we take the most prominent philosophers of law in the last century, you could claim that only Kelsen had a wider societal impact, and it was kind of heavily limited still, but mostly not as a philosopher of law. He was involved in things as a legal drafter, participating in commissions, introducing the constitutional system or the constitutions to Europe, arguing for them, and so on. But as in general education, for example, or general culture, you don't miss much if you don't know who Hans Kelsen is. It's not a huge transgression like you would have it in other places. Maybe even in general philosophy, you have kind of, for example, nowadays, who's a famous public general philosopher? You might dislike him or not, but for example, everybody knows, let's say, Slavoj Žižek, maybe, who's doing stuff like on a more general level.
Foucault as well, for example.
Foucault was one of those guys. Noam Chomsky is usually considered kind of like, he is a linguist, but he's considered to be a philosopher. So, but you can, like when you calculate all, then you can count maybe all the famous public philosophers on, doesn't reach a two-digit number, I think. Yeah, but this is the idea, and this is a bit more controversial to me. Does it have any practical impact, the stuff we do? And it's a thing that we were discussing even in Genoa when we were doing this conference about John Gardner. He has this piece, Why Study Jurisprudence, which is kind of like a nice piece, and he adopts a position in which basically, and I'm watering it down, it's kind of this humanistic discipline within the study of law in which you learn some technical matters, then you have this matter, this general matter of of jurisprudence that should teach you or widen your views, it should teach you a bit about critical thinking, and all the things that are kind of orthogonal to the study of law. Well, my experience in Belgrade, and it was always like this, this study of jurisprudence was always, I think, conceived as a bit of a more practical enterprise. One of the reasons was that general theory of law was always considered a part of jurisprudence, so there is that entire thing where you distinguish between, and it was done by Pattaro and the editors of the treatise of philosophy of law. You remember that they were always having these lawyers' philosophy of law and philosophers' philosophy of law, and this lawyers' philosophy of law was kind of conceived a bit as more practical. So do you think kind of like, could it be our choice that we are impractical, or that our research doesn't have any practical consequences, or is just as a matter of necessity?
I'm not sure. I mean, there was, I guess, but this was, I mean, I'm old, but not that old. I mean, this old discussion. There was a big discussion in Italy about the distinction between philosophy of law for lawyers, or lawyers' philosophy of law, or philosophy of law for philosophers. I'm not really sure how to draw the boundary, although I do think it's very convenient for philosophers of law to be within law schools rather than being in the philosophy department. It makes really good sense for us. I'm not sure whether for the world as a whole or not, but it definitely makes good sense for us. No, I mean, I guess there are a couple of insights that from other people that really inform my way of looking at the practical effects of philosophy of law, perhaps philosophy in general. They're both in the pragmatist kind of tradition world, so that's not a surprise. I mean, my heroes, most of my philosophical heroes at least, are within the pragmatist tradition. And one is, I think it is Elizabeth Anderson. You know Elizabeth Anderson? She's a political philosopher, super famous in the US, and super good. I love her, literally. I mean, all her books. And she's not really famous here in Europe, I guess. But anyways, or she should be more famous in Europe than she actually is. But I don't know. Anyways, and I think she was reinterpreting, kind of thinking about John Dewey's own attitude to the practical relevance of philosophy. And she says something which is really inspiring to me. I mean, it really puts me... I don't know, it's something that I refer to when I'm not really sure what I'm doing with something, which is the philosopher in general, and the philosopher of law, and the political philosopher too, should think a little bit like the art critic or, cinema critic. Like, you don't you don't read a review of a movie just to know whether the movie is good or bad. Right? What you write a review, I mean, you also want to know that, and the reviewer is obviously authorized by our social norms or whatever to tell us, normatively, you should go there to watch it, or you shouldn't go there. It's just a waste of time. The movie is bad, or the movie is good. But what he does also is this is a guy who has watched a lot of movies, like us. We have read a lot of books. We have thought things through carefully, supposedly. We think about these things, about politics and law all day long. And so it helps you to develop a better appreciation of whatever it is that's the object that he is commenting on. And I guess that's a very small practical effect, perhaps, like first of all, because you don't have many readers, so you're not going to help the appreciation of many people. But in general culture has a way of appropriating ideas that are very abstract from philosophers and then bring them down to earth in sometimes, and it's perhaps ideas that they don't even have a name on it, but that they become first popular in philosophy and then they go around the larger society. And I think it's a good idea to think of ourselves as we may or may not, it's not a necessity, be involved with direct normative judgments on, this is a good law, this is a bad law. We can do that, and perhaps we should do that in terms of, sincerity of our premises, and, let us be clear, I don't think that this is a good law. But apart from that, we should try to really help our readers, very few of them, very few people in general, to look at the thing and ask more competent questions about it, put in relation with other pieces of legislation or other decisions, try to identify hidden premises to the arguments that you're discussing, put them in relation with other arguments and see how they work together or whether they do not work well together. And generally, and this is the second suggestion, which really helps me a lot, is something by Stanley Cavell, who would say that, and he was also involved in the philosophy of cinema, so I guess it's all related in some sense, that part of the method of ordinary philosophy is to understand that you have a right, I think he puts it literally this way, to take yourself seriously, to take your intuitions seriously, right? So that you should begin by that. So what are my first gut reaction to this thing? When I think about it out in the open, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Is it good or bad? Or I don't know, what are the associations that I can make with other concepts in relation to this object that I'm commenting on? And of course, you shouldn't stop there. And looking carefully at how you speak and how other people speak and talk about the thing that you're writing about definitely helps. I mean, it's an extremely good first step. But it's obviously not the last one, right? So you should begin there and, try to take your reactions seriously and see where do they come from? Do they make sense? Is there a hidden belief or a tacit belief that I have that push me to, think this or that? Or, how can I go about and find out? So, yeah, that's... And again, the practical effect is extremely small, but it is a practical effect that of some sort, right? So not necessarily let's move the masses, let's change and transform the world. I mean, I'd be terrified if somebody followed my advice on things, I would. But, perhaps you can, whether they agree with you or not, you can help them think better the issues that, confront them anyways.
Maybe they could have experimental reasons to follow you.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
No,
because, as we all know, experimenting with things is good.
Yes, exactly. It makes life better. No, but I find... I'm trolling you, but yeah. No, but...
Yeah, exactly.
An obvious troll. Trolling obvious only to philosophers of law.
Well, not even to those. I mean, just us, basically, because you know me.
No, but I found what you said very interesting. Generally, I had considered in my years, like doing philosophy of law or trying to do philosophy of law, that maybe there are 3 levels of philosophy of law, like the one that is extremely abstract, the one that is extremely practical, and the one that is in between, that tries to take the abstract and then show how to maybe apply to the practical. And maybe the case is that we don't need all of us to do the 3 things, or all of us to be in the middle, or all of us to be in the abstract. I think that the bad thing is that if we all are in the abstract level, and then if we don't really try to think about any practical application, because we are trying to analyze a social object. So in this sense, what you said about these recommendations were extremely interesting. And I wanted to ask you so following this idea about how to do it, because this was basically something about a methodology of how to try to research or how to choose the subjects or how to research on them. What are your preferred topics of research? What do you think that is worth researching, for example, or that you have considered to be worth researching in your career?
The two answers don't necessarily go together. Right?
Absolutely, but let's hear them.
Assume that the topics I've chosen were all maybe chosen after long meditation.
No, but
no. Well, I guess my first big topic is equality of access to justice. I have it's coming out finally with Springer, my first monograph, which is on equal access to justice.
Congratulations!
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been very I think I started writing it like some 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So. Even more than that, unfortunately. I certainly start talking about it before. Yeah.
Does it have a promotional page on Springer? Did they already put up a promotion?
No. Well, I still have to sign the publishing contract. So.
But when they put it, we're plastering it in the podcast notes in the episode to promote.
Absolutely, with your photo and then the thing, and then
not my photo.
You heard about this first in the podcast.
Yes. So, and what I do there, I think ultimately it's a book on applied political philosophy, I guess. So it's a huge topic, access to justice. And I was first drawn to it because I started out as a procedural law guy, right? So this is a traditional classic topic in comparative procedural law, and Italians have a very large tradition in it because it's not clear whether they actually invented the name, but the guy who put the name on the map was an Italian guy, Mauro Cappelletti, a hugely famous procedural law scholar. He worked in the United States too, and he was based in Florence and then at Stanford Law School. And so what I try to do is sort of come up with arguments and ways of discussing arguments of what access to justice is in terms of an object. What is it that people claim when they claim access to justice and equality in access to justice? And then also some normative arguments on what are the bases of this claims that we have that sometimes... Well, there are very many, and they have very different objects and sometimes incompatible. And how do we ground them in something, not in a technical sense? I'm not on normative ground and all of that. But how can we come up with reasons for claiming these things? And then I try to apply it to a bunch of procedural institutions, the classic ones, settlement, when it should be legitimate, when it's not, what do we lose with settlements and confidential settlements in particular. So the whole topic of ADR, then collective litigation, class actions and all of that, the class action device and its mechanisms. And then, of course, the traditional, most obvious topic of legal aid and free legal counsel. And so I test the very abstract reflections that I do in the first parts of the book within these smaller topics. So that's one big area of research. And if I can do a little bit of self-promotion too,
Absolutely.
I organize and I'm the coordinator of an online course on access to justice with the University of Girona. And I think the inscriptions are now open. It is in Spanish, but anyways, so if you're interested, those who listen, please sign up.
Then
anyway.
You can give us the links.
Yes.
So to put also in the podcast.
Yeah, definitely. I will do that. We have a bunch of different scholars in different disciplines because we try to do a interdisciplinary perspective on the topic. And then, so this is one big thing. And it kind of I mean, there is continuity, I guess, but I'll just so. One thing that intrigued me, I would say, about the literature on access to justice is that it puts the sort of empirical question of what happens in real life legal systems right at the forefront of the thing. And I guess you cannot really say anything relevant about access to justice without at least looking at other disciplines, theology, economics, and all other empirical social sciences and their interdisciplinary connections and all of that. So this drove me to look at what sociologists and economists did, and so I started becoming interested in really trying to finding ways to use the more specific knowledge of empirical research within law and legal studies and the philosophy of law more generally. So, and here's another way that really helped me. It's also from Elizabeth Anderson. I'm not sure I wouldn't be able to locate the source of this when she said this, but she had, I think, a wonderful definition of epistemology as, one intuitive idea that philosophers get about epistemology is that it's philosophers who say to scientists, you should do this or you shouldn't do that, right? So normative kind of enterprise in which we as philosophers know what knowledge is, and we're going to go about, and I'm obviously putting a very stereotyped and paradoxical way of doing it. There are more sophisticated versions of this, and I'm sure nobody would agree that this is the epistemological goal. So big qualifications, but in which basically what we're after is finding out that one discipline or other is some form of astrology. And I have nothing against astrologists, but that, I wouldn't call it a science. Anyways, astrology, right? So, and that's wrong. I mean, the tests for truth are clearly internal to the discipline themselves. Not clearly, but I guess we should trust the people inside the discipline telling us what is it or what's not, something a reasonable belief to have on this or that topic. What we should do as philosophers instead is to try and look carefully at what these people do. What are, again, the implicit premises that they plug in their arguments that make them work? What are the assumptions that they make in order to produce the things that they produce, their theories? What is the structure of the theory? What kind of support and what kind of relation with evidence does it establish, or is it established upon? So it's not really, a normative enterprise of saying, rational choice theory doesn't work. And it's obviously a very stupid enterprise because we all know as philosophers that people are not rational, and we have a much more complicated view of human agency. No, well, you can say that, definitely, but you should say that within the context of empirical research on how people behave. What you can do is try and look carefully, these weird economists who think that human beings are rational. What do they actually write about? And where does this assumption of rationality really comes in? What work does it do within their theory? Do they have something specific in mind when they talk about rationality? Is it something that makes sense to call it rationality even? I mean, besides the fact that they call it that sometimes. And yeah, so this is the thing. And so I got gradually interested in economics, and then of course in Chicago everybody is a kind of a particular style of economics. But funnily enough, when I first arrived in Chicago, I was, and I still am. I was already a pragmatist, or I already loved John Dewey in particular. is, I guess, my all-time philosophical hero, I guess. I don't know, it's difficult to make a hierarchy. But anyways, and he was a professor at the University of Chicago for a long time. He founded there the laboratory school, which is, I'm not exactly sure administratively how connected it is with the University of Chicago, but it's high school, I think also middle school, and perhaps even for younger kids too, in Hyde Park in Chicago. But anyways, and he had a very important influence. He and another guy who was in Chicago, George Herbert Mead, on the sociology department. In fact, that was the Chicago school I was most familiar with. You know, the sociologists from the 1920s were witnessing to this crazy things that happened in Chicago since the ending of the 19th century until, you know, the 1950s, in which, you know, I guess the population grew like 50 times, 100 times in just a few decades. And it was people coming from all over the place, literally. I mean, especially Polish people, Italians, and Irish. And of course, there was a big black community too that was starting to grow. So in this mixture, they started to do field work and ethnographic research, I would guess. I was also very into the work of this guy also at the University of Chicago, which was Herbert Blumer, who was the founder. He used ideas from Mead and Dewey to found this movement, which is called symbolic interactionism. So I was very much against everything that, you know, people tend to associate with Chicago School of Economics. I mean, rational choice theory, markets everywhere, and all of that. And I guess then, you know, the rigor. I mean, I'm not sure politically. First of all, I'm not even sure anymore whether there is a Chicago School of Economics politically with fixed ideas. But that's a very controversial topic. So, and you know, I wouldn't necessarily go into that. But anyways, the rigor and passion which these people argue about stuff, and the way in which the thought and the discussions of people that were clearly identifiable within the Chicago School of Economics, like Gary Becker, for example, it just won me over in the sense of, man, I got to take this seriously. I have to take this extremely seriously, and I have to read this stuff. That it's not exactly what I expected. I mean, they're not as dumb as I thought. In fact, quite the opposite. You know,
nobody usually is.
And well, yeah, that's true. That's very true. Yes, and yeah. So what I started thinking about was, so there are limitations that I see. And I still buy the points that these people into more qualitative research on fine distinctions between types of agencies and kind of social actions and, you know, the influence of, I don't know, social norms and identities and all of this on human behavior. I see the point that something is missing there within some of the conceptual instruments that are typically used within, I don't know, mainstream economics. Sometimes people refer to that as kind of Chicago School economics. I doubt now that there is anything like mainstream economics. I mean, if it is, I don't know what it is. I mean, it's so complex and so many variations and so many differences within even, you know, the career of any single economist that I wouldn't attribute it to that. But anyways, so the goal became, all right, let's try and think carefully about how economists or some economists, and I studied Gary Becker in particular as, you know, kind of like the, you know, the leader of the darkest forces of Chicago economics. Exactly. And let's try to see, well, first, the assumptions that they are explicit about, how they work out and why they need them. the assumptions they are not explicit about, why they need them, if there is any, right, that even he didn't recognize. And can we use that stuff to push it closer to interpretations that would be more friendly to, the regular philosopher of action, that it's typically extremely critical of everything that comes out from Chicago economics. And funnily enough, I mean, John Dewey was the answer again. Yeah. And I think, and this is the topic of my presentation the other day with you guys. I think he had a very interesting, and this is sort of one focus of my research now, interesting conception of human habits, which fits extremely well with, I would say, the basic algebra of Becker's formal modeling of human action. It just needs a couple of modifications in terms of their interpretations, and particularly being more explicit about the fact that utility maximizing agent is not a rational agent. So that requires a little bit of interpretive work on the concept of utility and on the concept of choice. But once you're there, you're good to go, basically. And yeah, so this is what I'm really fascinated about. So so far I've taken it from the philosophical side, and I think there's a lot of work to do still on the philosophical side, just trying to come up with some conceptual revisions on habits, habit formation, utility, and all of that. And then hopefully, this can be, a useful concept to go about in the real world and try to study how humans behave. And obviously, I mean, this has already been done, right? So, I mean, it wouldn't be, I'm not suggesting that I'm the first one to think about human habits in terms of empirical research. But I guess there are some modifications to how research has been done today that could be useful, or at least, to ask new questions or bring them closer to the interests that philosophers of law in particular have in terms of what is a rule, what is a legal rule, how it's different than a social rule, how it's different than a moral rule, or is it different at all? And what kind of reasons do we have to, what's the term in English for derogabilidad?
Abrogation, derogation.
The feasibility.
No, the feasibility.
The feasibility. Yeah. What is, how do we, did we go away? No, it's still going.
It's okay.
So yeah, this is what I'm very much into right now.
When you did your talk, and it was a great talk, a couple of days ago, I was very interested, because you didn't mention we didn't have enough time. We have this format when it's 30 minutes, and then after that we have 30 minutes of discussion. But I was really interested in your talk, and I think you're not giving yourself enough credit in this analysis of habits. Actually, even if we have a very good analysis, for example, in pragmatism, and habits were redefined by both, for example, William James and John Dewey, and Dewey made an entire point of writing about habits or criticizing the common conceptions of habits which were simplistic. But kind of 100 years later, or more than 100 years later, I think that we have a simplistic conception of habits, maybe not in every one of the disciplines that you mentioned, but it seems that we still have a simplistic conception of habits in philosophy of law. Mm-hmm. And you started basically your talk by talking about the Hart's interpretation of the conception of habits that was present before Hart. Could you tell us a bit about these ideas of how law relates to habits before Hart, and what was Hart's or criticism of those ideas, and whether these criticisms are well-founded or ill-founded?
Yeah, so, well, Hart is the best philosopher of law in the 20th century, I guess. I mean, well, again...
Kelsen.
No. Or among the best. I mean, so...
Okay.
I will not go with him on this one very much, but, you know, it's not that I think we should burn his book. Definitely contrary to that. I mean, we should all read it. So basically, in the concept of law, he has this conception of habit, which is really, I guess, corresponds to what our first intuitions through ordinary language is, namely habits is a form of repetition. And he does, and he's very careful, and this is why I think he's really among the best. He's always extremely careful. In fact, he does famously, in just do a brief summary, in chapter 4 of the concept of law, Hart virtually demolishes Austin's theory of law as impractical or not, in terms of its ability to explain law in modern municipal legal systems. But he's very careful in not saying that he's doing that. What he's doing is demolishing a simplified version of Austin's theory of law, which is...
So British.
Well, yeah, I mean, Dworkin does that all the time. He doesn't say it as carefully, though.
Yeah.
I mean, again, no criticism to Ronald Dworkin, a great guy, absolutely. But Hart, I think, was better, regardless of what you think of the Hart-Dworkin debate, which I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion on. But anyways, Hart is extremely good. And he's extremely good in saying that, listen, this is not Austin. Austin is far more complex than this. And in fact... And let me get to Austin later on. It's a simplified version of Austin, which he doesn't use the term habits and threats, but that's what he's aiming at, uses as fundamental concept, the concept of habit, understood as a repetition, and threats, literally threats, as the two main concepts that we need in order to build conception of law for the modern municipal legal system. And why the simplified version is interesting and why do we need to demolish it? Because Hart says it comes up constantly in discussions and in intuitions, even of professional philosophers, on account of its enormous theoretical parsimony. I mean, if we can build a whole theory of law in general, I mean, it's not just one legal system, it's the theory of law in general, out of two concepts. Well, we are extremely smart people, right? I mean, of course, it doesn't work, ultimately, according to Hart. Habits and threats are not enough. Now, the thing is that this is not Austin's conception of law. Hart is explicit on that. And by the way, there's a very good article by John Dewey. I think it's second or third published article. I think it's 1894, in which, and it's a young Dewey, so he has the problem of making himself clear and showing the work, which obviously he doesn't have in the 1930s. Well, he is the most famous philosopher in the United States of America. So there he shows his work and he's extremely clear, and it's a wonderful paper. And it does things to Austin's theory of law in terms of sort of reconstructing it and exposing it, which are highly recommended. Because out of the many things that he does is distinguishing carefully between this thing that the sovereign is somebody who is habitually obeyed and doesn't obey anyone else, because it's the legal sovereign. And it doesn't obey anyone else in terms of legal rules, which is false too. But Austin says, and this is something that he takes from the tradition of utilitarianism, we would embed in, that the sovereign actually obeys to a lot of other people, obeys to moral opinion of the general masses, right? So anyway, things get extremely complex from there. I don't take that discussion, into any detail in the paper, or nor did I do in a presentation. But the point is, there's a whole tradition before Hart, before even Dewey. Dewey is not very explicit in citing, actually. There's perhaps a little problem there. But anyway, certainly he is the guy I came to this tradition with. Mm-hmm. He is very good in citing in ethics, and he has a wonderful chapter on utilitarianism, and he discusses what utilitarians say about habits. And it's a whole world. I mean, it all starts, perhaps there was somebody else before him, I'm not sure, perhaps not in the tradition. It all starts with David Hume, which is the guy I talk about in the paper, especially, and in the treatise. And he has this we all know the canonical sort of presentation of Hume's idea, in which, it is good in terms of theoretical parsimony, again, and it certainly fits with the idea of law in terms of habits and threats, and its theoretical parsimony. But it's far more sophisticated than that. And he has a list of distinctions among types of passions: original, direct, indirect, psychological principles. I mean, I count 5. One, for the love of me, I cannot understand, which is the 5th psychological principle. I cannot understand, so I didn't put it in the paper. The first 4 are really on point. I think they anticipate so much of what people are doing now and have been doing for, a few decades in microeconomics. And he has among them a principle of habituation, which is, I find, extremely interesting and worthwhile and worth taking a look at analytically in order to really understand what they were about when they were talking about habits, these crazy utilitarians of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. So, yeah. That's in a nutshell, not so much a nutshell, and if you can put something in a nutshell, then it deserves to stay there. This is Hilary Putnam.
Fair enough.
He's more fresh in the pragmatist tradition than I am. I actually did pragmatism. I actually did John Dewey for my magisterial work, which is an enhanced version of the master work. Basically a PhD before a PhD. It was like that 10 years ago in Serbia. And I read all the papers, and I find it completely refreshing that somebody's taking the pragmatist tradition seriously. I was also fascinated by Dewey, and most of the work was in political and legal philosophy of John Dewey. Dewey didn't leave much works in terms of legal philosophy proper, but there are papers and there are parts of his political philosophy books, but the things that he did it really well. Some things about legal reasoning, and most of the things that he did it in philosophy of law. He was basically just applying his general philosophy or epistemology or logic, the science of discovery, and in legal matters. But one of the things that fascinated me in terms of the pragmatic analysis was this reinterpretation of notions like habits, or pragmatism is the first philosophy, I think, or one of the first philosophies or movements in philosophy that takes account of the Darwinian turn in the natural sciences, which was fascinating. That also means that that the empiricism of pragmatism is heavily informed by the natural sciences, and they even make contributions to natural sciences, especially the early pragmatists. Okay, not Peirce, because Peirce just did his logic and things and disavowed everybody else who tried to do and change the name of his pragmatism to pragmaticism. So if we find a couple of more persons who like this pragmatism thing, maybe we can form a metaphysical club and roll something with it, because they started like in this it was a real club, like the Viennese did in the 20s, in the 30s, and in the 40s. They had this thing called Metaphysical Club, where the ideas were discussed. And Oliver Wendell Holmes was a part of the Metaphysical Club at one point. So the connection between legal philosophy and philosophy of pragmatism was rather real. Now, what is exactly Hart's, what would you say is the biggest problem that Hart has with this idea of habits that is to be found in, for example, Austin? And do you think that by giving a more true-to-life analysis of habits, we can solve actually some points of what Hart thinks, or at least the Hart simplified version of Austin's theory, that would allow us to keep some parts of Austin's theory in our contemporary notions of regarding the law, the obligatory character of law, the relation between societal rules or social rules and law?
Well, I think Hart has, I think very legitimately, a problem with, I mean, people are gonna be insulting me for saying this, but he has a problem with verificationism and behaviorism. And he sees that tradition, I mean, this is just oversimplifying, but to get the point of the kind of direction of analysis that I'm aiming at, he sees as one big problem of that tradition of Hume, Austin, and his more contemporary, imitators or students, a problem with a very simplistic psychology, perhaps materialist or empiricist, which has, I guess certainly verificationist and behaviorist. So verificationist in the sense that we have to reduce all concepts to observable phenomena, right? So we want to have a scientific concept of law. We got to say exactly what is it that we observe when we observe law, right? If we don't say that, then we don't have a scientific conception of law. And Hart has a problem with this research aim. And legitimately so. Legitimately, absolutely. He also has a problem with behaviorism in the sense that believing that, either mental concepts are not knowable by people other than the person who possesses them, or they don't even exist. Regardless, we shouldn't put them into any serious scientific enterprise. So this fits somewhat with verificationism as well. So we have to reduce all mental concepts that we have in our language to observable human behavior. Choice, the choice that you see, right? The conduct that you see. And the other thing is, I lost it. There was another important element to this. A third problem that he had. Well, these two are enough. And so I think he sees that tradition as, of course, Hume was neither a verificationist nor a behaviorist because the terms didn't even exist. He talks about experimental philosophy. He thinks he's doing experimental philosophy. He's not doing any experiment in any modern sense, so it's a bit weird. But anyway, he certainly meant something by it.
Experimental philosophy.
But there are people
My kind of experimental philosophy.
Let's experiment. No, I mean, there are certainly people in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, that believed that Hume was aiming at something like that. And that by being more explicit about verificationism and behaviorism, they were sort of continuing the Humean project. And Hart says, with reason, no, that's not going to happen. We can't do that. We can't do that because law is a far more difficult concept than the one that we can deal with by assuming verificationism and behaviorism. So the thing is that there are far richer conceptual resources within that tradition that we can use and exploit in order for them not to collapse into any form of verificationism and behaviorism, or forms of verificationism and behaviorisms which are not quite as simple and simplistic as, you know, the kind of first definitions that I give. And the concept of human habits is precisely in there as the key concept in which sort of tell me what you think about human habits and how they explain human behavior, and I'll tell you how verificationist or behaviorist you are. Something like that. So from a verificationist standpoint, habit is just repetition, an external behavior. You have to say that if you're, you know, a behaviorist verificationist. Kind of, what else could it be? I mean, all else is just irrelevant or not knowable. So let's just define it away in this way. So, and this is hard definition of habits, somewhat implicit definition. Doesn't even have to define them. Doesn't have to show anything in terms of when Austin uses in order to prove that that's what he means. And that definition wouldn't work for a theory of law. I mean, if law certainly is more than just repetition of behavior and, you know, convergent repetition of behavior, of individual behavior. Definitely. Point well taken, dear Herbert. Absolutely. The thing is, again, in the tradition of utilitarianism, and certainly in the tradition of pragmatism, and pragmatism is within the tradition of utilitarianism, in some sense, at least according to James, habits are more than that. What is more than that? I think, well, I have my definition, which I have an argument that it captures the essence. I'm not an essentialist, so I shouldn't say that. But, you know, the big points of these traditions, which is habits are a bundle of impulses, expectations, skills, and environmental factors, including one's social capital, which reduce the marginal costs of cognitive effort or awareness and motivational control over activity. So, definition is long, a little bit baroque, so there are many things that should enter into it to explain it, but just to give one key intuition. So, as I said, the principle of habituation is one of the 4 or 5 psychological principles that are easily identifiable in in Hume's treatise. And he talks about it as a peculiar effect. So the principle of habituation is a principle that should help us, you know, scholars who look at human behavior, to compare different passions together and predict choice. So we know the passions of somebody. How do we compare them and predict choice? Since they are different, they are competing in many ways. They are competing ends. The guy or the person has scarce resources, so is going to have to choose among these competing ends. How do we do that? One principle through which we do that, for comparing the strength of different passions that a person has, is this principle of habituation. The principle of habituation is the effect of repetition in the past on one's present inclinations toward one activity or another. So basically, if the object of your passion is an activity that was repeated in the past, then this will have a comparative advantage, so to speak, with respect to any passion which has an object, an activity that you haven't performed in the past. Why? Hume, I think, does give 2 explanations, and he sees them as connected. One is because repetition in the past increases your abilities now, right? So I have made coffee hundreds of times in my life. I'm better at doing coffee than I was when I started making coffee or being able to make coffee, 15 or something like that. So my skills for doing coffee has increased, and so it's easier for me now to make coffee. And so it's easier, for example, than making tea, for example. Let us suppose. I've never made tea in my life. Not true, but anyways, let us suppose it is like that. And the other one is that repetition in the past actually, as I said before, increases your inclination to the activity itself. Now, economists would immediately see something problematic. Or these are two effects, different effects. One is about skills, your abilities to perform the activity, and the other one is about your preferences, right? And I think Hume's key intuition, and it's an intuition that cuts across the entire tradition, and it's something, for example, Alfred Marshall was somewhat an utilitarian, certainly was a great economist, founder of neoclassical school of economics, whatever that is. He also observed a similar effect. His example was with good music, so with good habits, so to speak. How that sometimes we increase our skills in a way which shifts our preferences toward the activity itself. This is exactly the intuition about exposure to good music, right? So exposure to good music in the past increases your ability to appreciate good music, but also shifts your preferences toward good music. You like music more. And so Alfred Marshall noted this in the context of a discussion of possible exceptions to the law of decreasing marginal utility, right? So if we take this literally, the principle of habituation, it could look like an exception to the law of decreasing marginal utility, because you increase performance in the past and you want more of it now. So the marginal utility from the activity increases. And Marshall says, nah, because the law still holds for constant tastes. Here, your tastes are changing. So the law is still intact. The thing is that your tastes change. So, where was I? I kind of got lost. But the thing is,
got very deep into the explanation.
I think this is the key point, which economists, let's speak individually, Gary Becker saw at least, I guess now it's 55, 60 years ago, that there is something there. And there is something that we should consider when we study human behavior, namely that we shouldn't assume that preferences are exogenously determined and they can never change. And habits is a construct that helps to explain how preferences change. How? Through the effects of past activity over your inclinations now. Now, Becker had a very simple model, in fact, with a very simple algebra. Even I understand it, sort of. I wouldn't be able to actually use it concretely, but I do understand the things and the relations that he establishes. And it's changed things over time, and I think it's an interesting historical, and I've written about this, and I'm in the process of sending it to review, the historical sort of development of this idea of human habits. But to go back, my definition is a definition that attempts to fit within that problem, explaining how we can influence our own preferences, inclinations. Although I don't call them preferences, I think it'd be therapeutic to call them habits. In part because we don't have to assume anything about people's rationality if we do that. There are a couple of other changes that we need to do that in order not to assume that. But anyways, we can use the most hyper-rational models of human action and say, yeah, but this is not rationality. This is human habits doing their thing. Identifying, and Dewey had a wonderful expression, and it's exactly the assumption of utility maximization. A habit identifies the point of least resistance in overt action, right? So this is exactly a minimization exercise, but which is the same as a maximization exercise. So you're doing things, habits are the things that push you to do the easiest thing. You can modify them. Of course, it takes time and it takes a very difficult and very uncertain technology. And what you're doing is modifying the way in which the past influence your present choices and inclinations.
And how come rules in the middle of this? In the sense of, I think I could follow your explanation about what a habit is, at least in your definition, and with all this deep context in which you, like the context of discovery that you went into to your definition of habits. But then I think that clearly one thing that Hart was trying to say was that this motivational approach that I think that follows with this redefinition of habit is not enough to talk about, for example, law. And I think that is when he started with his idea of at least social rules. We are not about legal rules in itself, but then the idea of incorporating some other concept to try to account for the gap between this motivational explanation or of human behavior and then something else. So if you can just say something about that.
This is an enormously difficult question and topic. So just a couple of ideas. There is a lot on social rules done by this tradition of assuming that people are utility maximizers. One problem with that, in terms of, I think, how it's been received by philosophers and legal philosophers especially, is that this can't be it. We need something more than preferences to explain rules, right? Because, and what is it, this something more? Well, for example, along the lines of Hart, the fact that perhaps it's true that in this or that legal system, our commitments to social rules is just based on, habituation, thoughtless repetition of acts that we've done in the past, or strategic thinking. I'm complying with a social rule, not because I'm interested in the common good, and the common good that the social rule is supposed, that compliance with the social rule is supposed to produce, but simply because I'm scared about sanction. Or incentivized by the positive sanction, and you can look at it positively or negatively, either way. If you talk about habits, then this problem goes away. In the sense that it takes the economists talk about preferences, and it's not a reasonable objective to make them change their vocabulary. I mean, certainly it won't happen. But the fundamental the fundamental element of preference is that it is a marginal rate of substitution. So that how much you're willing to forgo something in order to have one unit more of another thing, right? So and that has nothing to do necessarily with your preferences. It doesn't have to do with, not in the common sense of preference, which is the one that philosophers typically respond to, or their sense of preference as something perhaps similar along the line of desires, but which is something different than values, it's something different than commitments, is something different than compulsions and all of that, right? So something that you have a clear mind about, that you know what it is, that you're conscious about your own preferences, and that you have a view on how to realize them in the most efficient way, in order to accomplish realize the most, the biggest set of your preferences, whatever that means. Now, if the fundamental is a marginal rate of substitution, then we can change all these we don't need all those other interpretations. What we need to do is try to relate these things in a way which seems useful to then go about and study in the empirical world. And the work has been done already, just needs some interpretational rearrangement. Now, will that convince philosophers that this is a complete account of what a commitment to a social rule is? No, I'm skeptical about that. And what you were mentioning about this gap between, pure motivations and, something else that pushes us to comply, to social rules. Yeah, it's one thing. It's definitely the kind of criticism that many, not all necessarily, there are philosophers of different persuasions will ask me about, right? So I guess we could go, one common mistake that I made throughout my entire life, and I keep making, is, and many people do make, but I'm talking about myself especially, try to take the last step first, right? So you shouldn't begin, and this is, by the way, this is a practical effect of John Dewey. I realize that this is a very stupid and silly mistake. You shouldn't start by the last step. Perhaps it is a good idea to have an idea of what the last step will look like, so that then you can go backwards and begin with the first step. And if you keep trying to do the last step first, you fall inevitably, always. The first step is the first step, right? So what I'm getting at is, let's try to unpack the intuitions that we have that make us skeptical that something like assuming that people are relentless utility maximizers, as I am willing to assume. What are the intuitions that tell us that this can't be? Especially it can't be when people are following social rules. One intuition is that, for example, when we follow a social rule, we hold the grudge and say, I really don't want to do that. I do that because, I should, but I don't want to do that. And the intuition is, if you understand utility as pleasure, for example, or expected utility as expected pleasure, then this doesn't seem to work very well, right? I don't think it's all that true, but anyways, a strong intuition that goes against it, right? When we comply with a social rule, we're not necessarily happy about it. This is my first or second, depending on the order, one of the two things that I discuss in the paper as kind of modifying, manipulating a little bit Hume's framework. Interpret pleasure as stimulation. So utility is not a metric of the objectives of choice, how we rank our objectives. It's a metric of motivation. What pushes us to act this way or the other. Whether we know it or not, we can be stimulated by things that we don't know we're stimulated by. But we're going to be acting on those on that stimulation, or things that we cannot control. Another way to sort of work with the intuition that it really can't be that people are relentless utility maximizers if they follow social rules is to see the kind of so to see complying with a social rule as a kind of investment on your own habits. I comply with the social rules and I'm not happy about it because what I'm doing is I'm accepting a cost now with a view of changing my habits in the future. So, for example, in the example that we discussed, kind of horrid example that was discussed the other day of a person spitting on...
this person's wife.
Well, no, I didn't want to say that.
Let's say this person's wife. Okay. And that's it.
But anyway, so there, I guess one way to interpret, and the question is, that seems to be a habit, spitting in the sink without washing it afterwards. That seems to be a habit, a very bad habit indeed, if you live with somebody else at least. And if there are no fairies who clean after you, definitely. But that seems very different than following a social rule. Yeah, but true that. But the point is, the kind of, so suppose you are that person and realizes that this is bad, shouldn't do that, right? So the strategy that you should think about in order to change that habit is what is about following a social rule. And in many ways, it is exactly that, right? I know that this isn't good behavior, that this isn't good behavior because it produces effects of disgust, to say it least, to other people, especially people I live with and have to live with that. So I'll try to change it following the social rule of not doing it. The problem is that you cannot switch it off and on as you want. You have to be strategic about it, especially with things that you've been doing for a long time. So it is the problem of the endogenous determination, formation, or modification of human habits. And that explains a little bit, at least, the intuition that when we follow a social rule, we're doing something that we wouldn't otherwise want to do. The third and final, and it's not in the paper because it needs... it's something that has to do with the stability of these preferences. Mm-hmm. I mean, the explanation is a little bit more complex than that. But so one traditional assumption that it's attributed, it's not true anymore. It once was attributed to economists is that they think of preferences as something that it's exogenously stamped on an agent who cannot do anything about that. We choose in light of our existing preferences. We do not choose our preferences, right? So this is the basic intuition. So they are exogenous, they are not endogenous to the process of choice itself. Now, when you introduce human habits, what you're doing is, so this situation of exogenous determination of preferences, namely they're not endogenous to the process of choice, makes formally the utility function that you write stable. They don't change. The parameters of the utility function, they don't change, they're fixed. Nothing you can do can change the utility function that you're trying to maximize given your budget. When you put human habits in, then the utility function is not necessarily stable, because what you're doing in the past changes your inclination in the present, changes your preferences, the rate at which you'd be willing to substitute things in your life, so to speak, right? So, why this is important? It is important because it is not, so because one intuition that it couldn't be that relentless utility maximizers follow social rules is that it is very odd to think of somebody who's following a social rules that condition it to his resources or the cost of the action. We understand the point of I'm committed to the social rule, I do it anyways. Save for exception that should be normally included in the rule. Otherwise, we're doing something that, that's messy, as we know, visibility and all of that. All right. So when you put in when you put in the issue of the stability of the utility function, then you have at least some conceptual instruments to think about cases in which the price, for example, of the activity or the good changes, but you keep doing it. Why? Because you're interested in your future preferences as well, your future habits as well, in my vocabulary. So, again, there are obviously intuitions that we cannot go from human habits to social rules, that something is missing, and I'm willing to accept them. The work is, step by step, try to make these intuitions more explicit. What are they based on? And try to find ways in which we can represent them within these conceptual resources. And if we cannot, then, let's look for other conceptual resources. Frankly, I don't have a full argument about it, but it seems to me that a lot can be done. A lot can be done in terms of at least having a theoretically useful conception of social rules that doesn't guarantee, but actually gives you confidence that you're not losing too much when you're using those theoretical resources to study them. We will not get a full account of why we should obey to law from this perspective. That's not the point of the perspective. So if what's missing is a full normative account of why it is a good thing to have law, then this will not give it. It will give information, perhaps, on some structural features of the law that we know that give us some reasons to believe that it's not such a bad idea to have law instead of not having it. Yes, but that's a different argument, though. Mm-hmm. And I would think this is a political argument or, a very abstract political argument for the legitimacy or the justice one legal system or other. But yeah, and it's perfectly admissible. I would be interested in doing it, and but it's not yet. And I'm doing it. Yes.
I'm going to try to yank you out of the finesse of economical argument for two reasons. One is I can't replicate your economic analysis in this case simply because I don't do much of it. And the second reason is that it's similar to the question or to the thing that we were discussing when you were doing the presentation. Kind of from one perspective, I find myself in complete agreement with your redefinition of habits, and I think it's very valuable. It's my problem, and it was my problem a couple of days ago when I first heard your analysis, is that social rules, or legal rules, have this characteristic, and we can put it any way we like, but it is these social rules that sometimes yank you out of a habit. And if I wanted to use, or I can use a Deweyan terminology in this case, no matter how complicated you make a habit out to be, its behavior results are similar. It's kind of this habitual behavior that is being repeated, no matter the analysis behind this habitual behavior. Now, and we have, I think, at least different relations of habits to, or different relations of social rules to something that is either an individual or a collective habit. At times, we start from a social rule, and then the social rule acts as an initial point of habit formation. Like, for example, you had in your discussion of this gross example that we have, and we all like it, let's face it, like the spitting example.
We keep going back to the same.
Yeah. So you have a bad habit which was formed as a habit, and like there is no discussion that we call that a habit in a sense, and it bears significant similarities to other habits, maybe more complicated habits that we have. Then you have a social rule, or you're faced, or you get to know a social rule, and kind of this habit bumps against this social rule. It would seem, or we have a habit and then we have a problem with carrying out the habit. So we are faced with something that we can call a choice. We are knowledgeable now about the social rule that prevents us or should prevent us from spitting in the sink and leaving it there without cleaning it up and so on, or in any other situation. So to me at least, it seems that, and I agree with you, that habits are a great tool if you redefine them to have an explanation of compliance with a social rule or a legal rule for that matter. I mean, to my mind, most of the time we just do legal things in virtue of habit and not in virtue, of course, of deliberating about in each and every case of whether we should do something and counting legal reasons in and counting moral reasons in and counting social norms in and so on. It's fortunate because we would probably go crazy, like in the morning when we get up and go to buy bread. But oftentimes, social rule seems to me is something that yanks you out of the habit. Or when you're made aware of the existence of a social rule, you either have to redefine your habits or you have to follow with your habits but bear the consequences of the non-compliance with the social rule. And that kind of creates a problem, at least in these situations, both for legal rules and social rules, I think, being explained in terms of habits, because it would seem that their role is kind of, at least in these situations, different than the role that habits have. They are not there to reduce the costs of however you define utility. They are there to basically, or their role seems to be from the perspective of habits, to disturb a habit. Or at least when you society-wise, to disturb a habit of a part of the population or a majority of the population and so on. How would you go about answering this from the perspective of this analysis of habits? Or is there a way to answer it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think I need to answer it in the sense that I think that's perfectly correct. And it's exactly what I mean. I mean, the thing is, I think you're still working with an intuition that habits is the behavior. Once you don't, I mean, in another paper that I have, which hopefully this one will come out, but we're still in the review process. But, well, I mean, anyways. Doesn't have to do it. I put it in terms of, and I'm more explicit of the Deweyan influence there, and I put it in terms of a methodological thesis, and this is the thesis that I would defend. I didn't present it like that in the paper because I wanted to connect it with heart. So, but the important thesis is methodological. I mean, it has very many sub-theses, but it's okay. And the methodological thesis is, how should we go about and study human behavior? Answer, by identifying its habits. Full stop. Then, of course, you define habits in particular ways and all of that. But this is the point I try to make. So, and what I mean by habit is this bundle of things that they have this effect and that you can write them up in this or that way, which means that, you know, they incorporate, as I said, static judgment and dynamic judgments. And these are the things you want to know. What are the social rules of people in Belgrade? Let's search for their habits. And in particular, let's search for their habits that include more or less explicit expectations on the effects of behavior on their social capital. That's what I'm saying. And the fact that it's a very good intuition, it's more than an intuition, it's a very good observation, it's exactly on point, and it's exactly what I want to make, and it connects with my more political arguments, that, yeah, it makes sense to have law and not just social rule generally, precisely because we want to do that. And through law, we can do that experimentally, for example, and attribute causality to things that we're doing. These are the effects of having changed our habits in this or that direction, of taking conscience and being aware of the effects of what we're doing together.
I have just one. It has always, but I've been fascinated by this. You probably been fascinated by this when you were reading Dewey, for example. So pragmatists always had, I don't know if Jules did much pragmatism or, for example, reading Dewey, but I was like really into it while I was doing my work. And the pragmatists, including later pragmatists, for example, Rorty, Putnam, even Donald Davidson and Robert Brandon, for example, like contemporary pragmatists, they had these fights against certain words. And one of the words that they had a fight against, it was truth. Quite famously, pragmatist theories of truth are not theories of truth at all, because they wanted to change the word or to displace the word completely. And Dewey had this wonderful idea of displacing it with two words, warranted.
Assertability.
Absolutely, and you know that. And kind of like, I loved it while I was reading it, but after 10 years, I don't think that you can replace the word truth, in the sense that you can't really, it's just this term and this concept, whatever you do, it's just always present. You can clarify it a bit. Most of the time you create kind of equivocations and stuff like that, but there isn't, I think what pragmatism has shown with these redefinitions, that there isn't anything magical with this redefinition, or if we try to use warranted assertability, it kind of doesn't work, and we still kind of use the old term and things like that. So that's my only worry with, and I'm thrilled about the project of kind of explaining habits in a way that plays a more important role in both social and legal rules. But I'm kind of worried if you draw too much into habits, even if it's kind of technically speaking true. So, for example, if you add a reflexive moment to it, if you add responses to external stimulus, if you add the responses to internal stimulus, so if you make it into an all-encompassing concept that kind of loses its identity, which doesn't have to be a problem, but if you kind of delimit it in the sense that when you have this moment in which you have a novel stimulus, then you have the reaction, then you have a habit forming out of this reaction, and it's based on what the reaction is. I think it makes the point more poignant, or it makes it a bit more like easier to swallow. I don't know what you think about it.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. Yeah, it's a very all-encompassing definition. I mean, again, my idea is that we should talk about habits and not preferences. That preference is a much more ambiguous word for the thing that we generally do with them. That, now there are preferences, there are time preferences, there are the effects on, there's endogenous formation of preferences, and all the things that economists do with these things, I think we can do them by talking about habit. So I think it's a little bit better than talking about preferences because it doesn't, carry all the habit implications of the use of preferences. Should we distinguish it? Yeah, I mean, I think that there is an interest in simplicity and parsimony, right? So the least number of things that we use, the better for our theoretical ambitions and all of that. Yeah. One thing is the importance of the distinction between habits, the quality of stability of human habits. The claim is not, two things then. The claim is not that people have stable habits. I'm no idea whether that's true or false. I think intuitively they do have somewhat stable habits. Yeah. That doesn't mean, however, that they always do the same thing. Because if you accept my definition of habit, it's not necessarily an implication that if you have a habit, you're repeating one action several times. I mean, in my definition, of course, we are attempting to account for, measure, whatever you want, the effects of past experiences on your present inclinations. That's present and future ones. So that's the basic thing of having a habit. Thing is, if you consider the distinction between compulsions and commitments, now I didn't, which I discussed in the presentation, I cannot get into the details here, and I don't do that in the paper, I do that in the other paper. One key distinction is between them that you can immediately see, and it's an implication of writing the model in the way I propose to write it, is that compulsions, forming a compulsion reduces your full income. So the total resources that you have at your disposal. So it both increases relative marginal utility over one activity and reduces your income. That means, if I'm not totally mistaken, that you're going to do that thing more. You have less money and a bigger want for the thing. You're going to do it more, right? Relatively than before. Or, better said, a bigger part of your budget is going to go to that thing. Commitments, they are in many ways the opposite of compulsions, and part of being the opposite is that they increase your full income. So, not necessarily your money income. It's not that you get richer necessarily. That may be a further effect down the line, whatever, but your full income. So the productivity of your time, basically. Mm-hmm. And that means that, yes, your marginal utility over the activity increases. But that doesn't mean that you're doing the thing more because there's an income effect. You have more resources. So perhaps you're doing other things more. You don't know. Perhaps you're never repeating the thing, and you're still committed to the activity.
So you're basically committed to, in some sense, apply this law about maximizing but the outputs of applying it can be different activities. In the sense of, I'm trying to reconstruct, for example, your definition of habit, mm-hmm. trying to make it compatible with the idea that even if we have a habit, for example, the activities that follow this habit can be different.
Yeah, definitely.
So I was more thinking about, you have like the habit of, for example, doing things in some specific way, in this, for example, calculations or maybe maximizing or whatever. And this can explain or can account for the fact that following a habit or having a habit does not imply doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it becomes ambiguous, the expression following a habit. It doesn't mean much anymore. Yeah. And you know, this is in the paper, which is it's in Italian and which is closer to publication that I have on these topics, specific topics. I don't call them habits. I call them abitudini, which is the translation of habits, with a little star. Asterisk. So in order to make clear that I'm not in the business, you know, I accept that that's not the meaning of habit in ordinary language. Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. The point is, that's the close, and Dewey is also very explicit about that. You know, perhaps you could call it attitude, you could call it skill, you could call it whatever you want. I mean, the point is being clear or what it is. Attitude, it's not, it doesn't incorporate skills. Skills, certainly they're part of a habit, but they're not the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Preferences, it has the problem of it suggests, I mean, then when you're clear with the words, it doesn't suggest it anymore, as economists don't suggest it anymore, basically, I think. It has this idea that, you know, you're conscious of the thing you prefer. And by preferring it, you're doing it something explicit, you're doing something deliberate, and you're doing something that has reason for and against, and you're doing a calculation. Habits, no. I mean, it is normally associated with thoughtless action. I do it out of habit. It means that I haven't thought about it. So, yes. But once we clear out that thing, that's part of it. Of course, if your habit is a compulsion, then you're obviously not really aware of what you're doing and what it is that you're stimulated by. I mean, you're probably very aware of one part of your compulsion, like, for example, the drug addict, you know, is obviously very aware that he wants drugs, that specific drugs, but is not totally aware of the further effects of what he's doing, or he can't really control himself, or we can imagine a moment in his addiction that he arrives at, and, you know, I want to stop, but I can't stop, right? And that's something that, I mean, this algebra was developed by Becker in a very famous paper, in different papers, but one of his most famous one is Rational Addictions. And he's talking about rational addiction, how to make addiction, which seems at first sight a totally irrational behavior, and so not the subject of utility maximizing behavior. It's weird to think of the drug addict as somebody who's maximizing something. But I mean, there are problems with them, always very much discussed, but I think is on the right track on many things.
So, to tie things in with the first part of the conversation, one final question. When can we expect a self-help book on changing and forming habits from you?
And by the way, there are so many of those. So it's
an insane amount. Atomic habits, changeable, unchangeable habits.
And also I think there are other two connections in sort of the popular market of books, which obviously not very much into. I wouldn't be able to write something like that, or to write it in order for it to sell.
Fortunately, nobody writes their own books anymore.
Yeah, probably. It's AI, everything AI. Sometimes I think, I just looking online sometimes, they're sold together with things on flow, which is a more respectable concept than many of this self-help. And the idea represents that exactly, right? So the idea of commitment especially represents that. And the idea of, you know, and it's also something extremely important that this is true, somewhat overlooked by mainstream economics or neoclassical economics, that work sometimes is not irksome, as economists tend to think, that people like to work. You know, when under several conditions, and obviously they like to get paid anyways for their work, but you know, it's not a given that work is irksome and people don't want to do it. There are conditions under which you actually want to work for the utility or the pleasure that you get out of work itself. And again, the concept of commitment does, I think, something to represent, not explain, because for that you need empirical data and see whether you can use that model to explain the empirical data in some interesting sense. But certainly to represent the intuition that sometimes work is something that you would do even if they didn't pay you. And third, the kind of more Eastern philosophical thing of, you know, that there is, for some reason, the concept of flow is and the concept also of change in habits is associated with Eastern philosophy and Buddhism and meditation and control of your thoughts in your mind and all of that. I'm not sure whether there is anything to these connections. I'm certainly very much interested in Eastern philosophy, but I'm totally ignorant about it. So I don't know, perhaps maybe in 20 years, I'll come up with a research project on Eastern philosophy. And
somebody rediscovered Stoicism recently. Also, Stoicism has this important...
Like gasp.
Yeah, Stoicism. No, yeah, but he's doing the stuff. So he just pushed flow there for us to comment, to get inspired by it. So, yeah. But no, this podcast is a good example of situations in which...
Flowing.
I think we went way over time.
No, it's fine.
No, but I think that on this note, we can say thank you very much, Marco, to be here, and thank you very much for accepting in participating in this flow of podcast that we started, like, I think 1 hour ago.
A couple of hours ago.
No, 1 hour.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Preparatory work.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
It was fun for us, maybe not so much for you.
No, it was extremely fun. No.
Because
5 minutes. And no, thank you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure. I mean, yeah, the opportunity to talk, and you know, I think it's always helpful. Always helpful. Thank you.
And we will wait for your book on equal access to justice to be published.
Yes.
Yes.
I will send it. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.